At the end of 1941, the winter sky over Washington cast a grey chill on the solemn stone blocks of the Army General Staff Headquarters. In a room on the upper floor, General George C. Marshall sat behind a large desk, pale light falling onto rows of open personnel files. On the pages were names, not just ranks, but careers, memories, entire lives of soldiering. Marshall read each line, marked each decision. Every underline meant one man would have to leave the army. No explanations, no argument, no exceptions. Across the room, a group of senior officers stood in silence. One clenched his gloves, another stared at the floor. Faces solemn, eyes waiting. They understood today was no longer about seniority or reputation. Today came down to a single question: who was ready for war, and who was not? Marshall had no need to raise his voice. He had once said, "War does not wait for the old. We must choose those who will lead or accept defeat." In his hands was not a dismissal list. It was a map of the army's future. The war had yet to begin. But in that room, Marshall had already made his move. That quiet purge did not unfold in a vacuum. It was the inevitable outcome of a series of harsh realities that had pushed the U.S. military to the edge. In the late 1930s, the United States remained steeped in the lingering effects of the Great Depression and a strong current of isolationism, a prevailing mindset that the turmoil in Europe was not Washington's concern. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, though quietly pursuing rearmament, continued to reassure a war-weary public with statements like, "I have seen war and I hate it." But behind that caution lay a very real and very serious concern. The U.S. Army at the time was so small that it could barely defend the homeland, let alone project force overseas. In 1939, its regular forces numbered barely 190,000 troops, ranking 19th in the world behind even Portugal. One contemporary officer offered a bitter assessment. "This is a skeleton. There's a frame, but no muscle." The problem extended beyond numbers. In terms of equipment, the U.S. Army looked as if it had stepped out of the final days of World War I. Outdated helmets, bolt-action rifles, artillery pulled by horses. While the German army had already mechanized and embraced Blitzkrieg tactics, many American units still relied on cavalry as their core force. Younger officers pushed for change, only to be met with threats of disciplinary action. Captain Dwight D. Eisenhower, who would later command Allied forces in Europe, once came close to facing a court-martial for proposing an expansion of armored forces. Training programs remained fixated on static, linear defense, preparing for a kind of war that no longer existed, far removed from the new reality taking shape abroad. While the army was still struggling with the challenge of rebuilding, the American political system was also shifting slowly. It was not until September 1940, a full year after war had erupted in Europe, that Congress passed the first Peacetime Conscription Act, allowing the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of young men. As a result, a reserve force began to take shape, bringing with it an urgent demand, a new generation of commanders, energetic and capable of leading an army that was growing larger by the month. But to bring that generation into the ranks, someone had to clear the path. And the man who stepped forward to do it was George Catlett Marshall. With a single signature, he put an end to the careers of officers who no longer fit. With one decision, he launched a reform effort that would prepare America for the most brutal conflict in modern history. On the 1st of September 1939, the same day German troops crossed into Poland and triggered a shockwave that would soon engulf Europe, a quiet decision was signed in Washington. George Catlett Marshall, then a little-known major general outside military circles, was appointed Chief of Staff of the United States Army. It was not a conventional choice. President Roosevelt passed over 33 senior officers, including Lieutenant General Hugh A. Drum, a veteran widely seen as the default candidate for the post. But Roosevelt, who was gradually preparing for the possibility that the United States could not stay out of the war, understood this was not a moment for tradition. He needed someone who could foresee what was coming and had the will to act. Marshall entered the role not with power or fame, but with a vision forged over 2 decades. A veteran of World War I, he had served as a staff officer to General John J. Pershing in the American Expeditionary Forces in Europe. In the Saint-Mihiel and Meuse-Argonne offensives, he witnessed firsthand the price American soldiers paid for stepping onto the battlefield poorly prepared. Inadequate training, chaotic command structures, and unrealistic decisions from aging generals who lacked experience all contributed to unnecessary losses. The frustration from those days had never faded, and now, as the head of the Army staff, Marshall held in his hands the opportunity to bring change. He understood clearly that America could not enter a new global war with an underprepared army, and certainly could not send millions of young soldiers into battle under the leadership of men too slow to grasp how warfare was evolving. For Marshall, reform was not just an idea, it was a necessity, and he was ready to take full responsibility to begin that difficult transformation. From his earliest days as Chief of Staff, Marshall quickly recognized that the biggest obstacle to rebuilding the force did not lie in budget constraints or public opinion. It came from within the military itself, specifically from the senior officer corps who were commanding the Army's main units across the country. In October 1939, just 1 month into his new role, he spoke plainly in a closed meeting. The majority of current generals, he said, were too old to withstand the pace and pressure of modern warfare. In Marshall's view, many of them had been left behind by time, their thinking trapped in outdated manuals, and they could no longer adapt to the rapidly changing realities on the battlefields of Europe. This was not a matter of opinion. For nearly 2 decades of peace, the U.S. Army had remained virtually frozen in structure. Promotions were based solely on seniority. An officer could only rise in rank when someone above him retired or died. That system kept many men stuck at the same rank for decades, not because they lacked ability, but because time served was the only metric that mattered. Marshall himself was living proof. At the end of World War I, he held the rank of colonel. After the war, he was demoted to major and had to wait 15 years to regain his former rank. And he knew he was not the only one who had endured that paradox. The result was a sluggish and aging command structure, incapable of handling the kind of fast-paced and intense warfare that was already unfolding in Poland and France. In internal reports, Marshall used a blunt but accurate metaphor. His officer corps was full of rotting wood. A block of wood might hold firm in peacetime, but in war, a single crack could cause the entire structure to splinter. To build an army capable of expanding tenfold in just a few years, Marshall needed commanders who could act decisively, make bold decisions, and embrace new concepts of warfare. But that path was blocked by a layer of officers in their 50s and 60s, men who had once been pillars of the force but were now out of step with the battlefield that was rapidly taking shape. Once Marshall clearly saw the rotting wood embedded within the system, he did not hesitate. He understood that if the U.S. Army was to enter the age of modern warfare with real strength, the first step was not to buy more guns, but to change the hands that held them. And to do that, he had to act early, while time was still on his side. The motivation for reform came from many directions, but ultimately centered on one principle: the U.S. military needed a new brain not only in combat thinking, but in how it was organized and how people were selected. Many senior officers at the time had reached an age where leading in the harsh conditions of mobile warfare had become unrealistic, not only due to physical limitations, but also because of slower reactions and weakened decision-making. The grip of conservatism ran so deep that some still saw mechanization as a threat rather than a solution, even as Germany's Blitzkrieg tactics proved the opposite. Beyond issues of health and mindset, Marshall paid special attention to one other factor: real-world performance. He did not care about glowing resumes or achievements during peacetime. The only thing that mattered was the ability to command effectively under pressure. Officers who failed to meet that standard regardless of rank or age were removed. On the other hand, he believed that if America wanted to promote the likes of Eisenhower, Bradley, or Patton to leadership, then it had to clear away the decaying steps beneath their feet. A new generation needed space to rise. When Congress passed a law in July 1940, allowing officer promotions based on merit rather than seniority, Marshall acted immediately. He formed a personnel review board composed of 6 retired officers, led by General Malin Craig, his direct predecessor. The press gave the board a bitter nickname at the time, the Weed-Pulling Committee. But Marshall was unfazed. His instruction was clear: all past glories were irrelevant if a man could not carry out the task at hand. The review process began in late 1940 and quickly produced results. In just the first 6 months, nearly 200 officers from captain to colonel were removed from the rolls. That number continued to grow as the review expanded to include the National Guard and Reserve forces. In the summer and fall of 1941 alone, hundreds more were retired, discharged, or reassigned. By the time the reform effort concluded, the total number of dismissals had surpassed 600, a figure without precedent in the history of the U.S. Army during peacetime. What stood out was that Marshall did not carry out this process with sweeping executions. Each case was reviewed with careful attention to practical ability. Age was only one factor in a larger set of considerations. Some older officers were retained due to their sharpness and extraordinary work ethic, such as George S. Patton at age 54. Conversely, many younger officers who lacked energy, adaptability, or passion were dismissed without hesitation. Marshall believed that with the right person in place, an entire force could transform in just a few months. But with the wrong person, no amount of troops or ammunition could prevent a failure already foretold. He once said, "Give a capable man just 3 soldiers and a truck, and he will make something of it. Give a mediocre one a whole corps, and he will waste it." Harsh standards in selection were not acts of cruelty. They were the only way to avoid needless sacrifice down the road. Marshall understood that clearly, and he did not allow himself any delay. Naturally, no one could reshape such a vast system without touching sensitive nerves. The purge that Marshall initiated stirred unease within the ranks and ignited quiet resistance both in the army and in political circles. Inside the army, older officers, or simply those who saw their future fading from the personnel lists, began murmuring about times changing too fast. Some voiced public dissent. Others chose to quietly step aside in discontent. A few expressed concern that the army was draining its own reservoir of precious experience. One military newspaper even accused Marshall of triggering a brain drain, squandering the minds that had guided the force for years. Marshall responded with a short, cold remark that ended all rebuttals. "I am not removing brains. I am treating arteriosclerosis." A reply that was calm yet cutting, mirroring how he handled the aging machine, without noise, without compromise, but with absolute clarity. Beyond the military, tension rippled into Congress. Some lawmakers grew uneasy when generals close to them, or representing their states, were removed from command. One went so far as to directly question Marshall about his dismissal of a National Guard general. That day, the man known as the calmest figure in the army delivered an answer with unexpected firmness. "If he stays, I will go. If I stay, he must go." The words were soft, but the room fell silent. Everyone understood that America was nearing war, and no one wanted to lose a decisive chief of staff like Marshall in exchange for a second-rate officer who thrived only on connections. The matter even reached the Supreme Court, when Justice Felix Frankfurter, a close friend of Roosevelt, forwarded a complaint from a reservist acquaintance. As always, Marshall did not deflect. He answered in a single sentence. "Most of our senior reserve officers today are rotting wood. They must be cleared from the service as soon as possible." Concise, firm, and leaving nothing more to explain. Those reactions, to Marshall, were not obstacles. They were the natural result of a surgical operation that cut deep into the very marrow of an organization long accustomed to stability. But the most telling response came from the younger generation of officers. For them, Marshall's actions were not a threat but a signal. The time had come for those with real ability to step forward. the atmosphere in the barracks began to shift rapidly, tense but unmistakable. No one dared to feel complacent in the rank they held. Everyone understood: either prove your worth or be seen as the next to go. Marshall did not need to shout slogans. The way he acted, quietly and without compromise, was enough to send the message. In the coming war, only those truly worthy would be given the right to command American troops. The sweeping reform led by Marshall quickly produced clear changes in the command structure of the United States Army. A new generation of officers, practical, adaptable, and proactive, began to appear more and more in key positions. Faces that would later become icons of American military victory, such as Dwight D. Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, Matthew Ridgway, Mark Clark, and George Patton all entered their upward trajectories during this very period. In September 1941, Eisenhower was still a lieutenant colonel working in a staff role in the rear. Just over a year later, he had become a lieutenant general and was given command of American forces in the North African campaign. By 1944, Eisenhower was the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe. He would later acknowledge that without the bold bloodletting driven by Marshall, younger officers like himself would never have had the opportunity to step up at the right moment. Marshall did not just change the people, he built a system of selection grounded in real-world testing. In 1941, he organized unprecedented large-scale war games, most notably the Louisiana Maneuvers, involving over 4,000,000 troops. These pre-war rehearsals served as a merciless test for senior commanders. The results revealed that most struggled to handle rapid deployments, coordinate mobile operations, or make decisive calls in complex scenarios. After the exercises, only 11 out of 42 participating generals were deemed capable of leading troops in actual combat. The rest were reassigned or removed from frontline roles. This reality confirmed what Marshall had seen from the outset. Those tied to the peacetime machinery were not necessarily ready for the demands of modern warfare. When hostilities erupted, only a small handful, such as Walter Kruger, commander of the 6th Army in the Pacific, remained in battlefield command. The rest were replaced by a new generation of officers, most of whom had risen during the 1940 to 1942 wave of reform. Thanks to the newly selected generation of commanders, the United States Army expanded at an astonishing pace, while still maintaining discipline and combat effectiveness. When Marshall assumed office in 1939, the entire army had fewer than 200,000 personnel, including a still nascent air force. 2 years later, that number had exceeded 1.4 million and continued to reach 8 million at its peak in 1945. Such a vast citizen army required a flexible organizational system, a strong command structure, and a high sense of unity. Marshall and his team had prepared exactly that, not only in terms of personnel but also in operational mindset. The generation of officers who emerged from the reform became pillars in training recruits, establishing rapid training camps, organizing large-scale instruction, and instilling fighting spirit into millions of new soldiers. They were the ones who shaped the face of the American military during World War II, a force that was mobile, proactive, adaptable, and decisive in action. Throughout the war, Marshall maintained rigorous standards for selection and promotion. When General George Kenney was assigned to command air forces in the Pacific in 1942, Marshall gave full support to his sweeping overhaul, which removed 5 generals and dozens of field-grade officers who failed to meet the demands. At the North African front, when certain commanders proved slow and indecisive during the Kasserine Pass campaign, they were promptly reassigned and replaced with more resolute leaders. This gave rise to a system with strong self-corrective power. Those with real capability advanced rapidly, while those lacking battlefield resolve were forced to step aside. This mechanism encouraged commanders to act boldly and accept tactical risks in pursuit of strategic results. Each general understood that success would be rewarded, while failure would not be excused. That spirit became one of the core factors that transformed the American military into one of the most effective war machines of its time. One story often recounted among army leadership serves as a vivid illustration of George Marshall's command philosophy. Immediately after the United States declared war, he issued an urgent order for a general to go to Britain and take command in an upcoming operation. The order had been signed, the transport ship was ready, and the timeline was counted in hours. But instead of departing, the general sent back a peculiar report. His wife was away, the house was not in order, and he needed more time to settle his affairs at home. The report was delivered to Marshall's desk. He skimmed it, set it down, then picked up the phone and made a direct call. His voice was calm but brief. "I was told you refused the assignment due to family reasons. Is that correct?" The voice on the other end maintained the same explanation. Marshall did not argue, nor did he show emotion. He simply replied with the same tone he used to sign a routine dispatch. "We are at war. You are a general. I'm sorry, but by tomorrow morning, you will no longer be in the army." The next morning, the general's name disappeared from the command list, just as Marshall had said. That decision did not stem from coldness. It was rooted in an unyielding principle. Those entrusted with power at the outbreak of war must bring their whole selves into the fight, without anything holding them back. Although his standards were strict, Marshall never completely shut the door on those who had once failed. Some generals removed from the battlefield were reassigned for retraining, placed in more suitable roles, and monitored as they worked to regain their competence. When he saw they were ready, he gave them another opportunity, this time with higher expectations but also with clearer trust. It was this combination of rigorous discipline and flexible adjustment that kept the U.S. military from sliding into a culture of purges while maintaining a truly capable core of personnel throughout the war. Under Marshall's leadership, mistakes could be corrected, but hesitation never had a place. Looking back on America's entire path to wartime readiness, the command restructuring launched by George Marshall stands out as one of the most strategic turning points. Most modern military historians agree that it was a decisive move that allowed the U.S. Army to shed its outdated peacetime shell and enter World War II with a completely new face, young, agile, and effective. Journalist Thomas E. Ricks called Marshall the father of the modern American armed forces, not because he led troops into battle, but because he built the organizational backbone that made every victory possible. President Roosevelt once worried that 50 years from now, no one will remember who George Marshall was, a concern that fortunately never came true. Today, Marshall's name is tied not only to the defeat of the Axis powers, but also to the Marshall Plan, the post-war program that helped rebuild Europe and reshape the Western world. Marshall was not a man who stirred crowds like Patton, nor did he carry the political aura of Eisenhower, but he possessed something even more valuable, a vision beyond the moment and an unshakable will. The reform he initiated demanded resolve, a willingness to confront resistance, and a firm belief that true capability must be the sole standard in choosing who would lead troops. At the time it unfolded, many voices of opposition emerged. Some viewed him as overly harsh, even cold, toward officers who had long served the force. Yet as the war entered its most brutal phase, those decisions proved their worth. Millions of American soldiers were led by people who understood what modern war entailed and knew how to guide them through it alive. Dwight Eisenhower, one of the young officers elevated under Marshall's guidance, once recalled the 1,941 Louisiana maneuvers with admiration. He just kicked them right out of the room, but he immediately added, "All in all, I think he was right." History is often rewritten by victory, but in George Marshall's case, the victory was a direct consequence of actions he quietly undertook before the first battle began. From that story, later generations have drawn a profound lesson, that people are always the core of any organization. Weapons, tactics, and resources are merely tools. It is the decision-makers who shape destiny. Marshall showed that to win, an institution needs not only fresh faces, but also the courage to discard what has grown obsolete. Every renewal carries loss, but delay always comes at a higher cost. The question Marshall left behind remains as relevant as ever. In critical moments, who among us has the courage to cut away what has rotted to save what is still growing? His answer, delivered through action rather than words, helped shape a victorious army. And from there, his name was etched not only into the history of warfare, but onto the political map of the modern world. Not through fortresses, but through clarity and responsibility in leadership.